Hey there! This video is going to be a full menu walkthrough and setup guide for shooting video on the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. Now, the menu in this camera is very deep with a lot of options, but I'll do my best to cover as much as I can. I'll only be covering video stuff in this video, so if you're looking for photography settings, this is not going to be the video for you. I'm sure there are some other creators out there making videos on photography settings for this camera, but like I said, I'm just going to be focusing on video stuff in this video. Now, I'll go through all the settings and let you know how I set it up and how I personally would use this camera to get the best image quality possible. So like I said, it's how I would set up this camera to get maximum image quality. So we're going to be using stuff like manual exposure, shooting in log, all that kind of stuff. But I will go through and explain all of the settings and why I choose what I choose. Now, I will also skip over some stuff that I either don't use or don't change. So if I don't talk about it in this video, then I just leave it to its default settings. I do want to mention that this video is not sponsored whatsoever. So if you're enjoying this kind of content and you get value out of this video, please consider hitting subscribe. That would be awesome. I also want to mention that the ZV-E10 Mark II and this lens were loaned to me from B&H Photo. So huge thanks to B&H for letting me use gear like this to make videos like this for all of you. If you are looking to do any shopping, please go check out B&H. It's where I personally buy most of my stuff from. There are links in the description for the ZV-E10 II and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So huge thanks to B&H for making videos like this possible. I also want to mention that I reset the camera before getting started here. I did have to tweak just a couple of settings to make the tutorial, but basically the camera is how it would be out of the box. I also want to mention that I am currently on firmware version 1.00 on this camera. There has not been a firmware update on this camera since it's been released, but I just want to mention what firmware that I am on at the time of recording this. So if you watch this later and there are changes, keep in mind I'm on firmware 1.00. Okay, grab your camera so you can follow along and let's get into it. So a couple of things about the physical controls and operation of the camera. Looking at the top of the camera, there's a couple things going on here, but the biggest one is I just want to make sure you're in movie mode for shooting videos. So if you flip the switch to the left, you'll be doing photography. If you flip it all the way to the right, it's S and Q, which stands for slow and quick. We'll talk about that in this video. We have a record button. We have a C1, which is a customizable button here. We have a exposure control. We have the shutter button, the zoom rocker, and the on and off switch. Now onto the back of the camera, we have a couple things I just want to mention. We have the menu button here, which we're going to use quite a bit going in and out of the menu. We have the function button here, which when you press that, that will bring up the function menu, which you can customize, and we'll talk about that in this video. We also have the dial here for controlling all sorts of stuff. And we have the button in the middle. We have the playback button, the trash can, and then we also, you can see there's labels here for different things you can operate the camera with by pressing up, down, left, and right on this dial. This also does have some touchscreen capabilities, which I just want to mention, and we will talk about how to customize those as well. So if you swipe from the side, you can see there is another menu here that pops up, and you can get rid of this by swiping away or swiping, from either side. And then you also, if you swipe up, you can access the function button, function menu, just as I did with the FN button here. So let's get into the menu. All right, so diving into the menu here, I want to point out a couple different things. On the left here, we have these main folders or categories, and then within those, we have other subfolders or subcategories, and then items in all of those. Now, I also want to mention here, as you're navigating through this, you can see that there is a page index. So this is page 6 out of 56, 7 out of 56, etc. So if you're wondering what page you're on as you're following along, it's pretty easy to figure that out. So we'll start over here up at the star, which is the My menu, and we'll actually talk about this later on in the video, but this is a way that you can customize the settings in there and you can access a bunch of stuff really quickly. I don't tend to use this very much because most of which I am looking for is in the main menu. So this is something that they added a few years ago in their cameras, and I absolutely love this implementation because pretty much everything that you need is in here. A lot of this stuff you will actually find later on in the menu, and I'll show you where that stuff is. And there's a little bit of differences for some of them, but most of the stuff and most of the settings are located in here, and this is kind of where I like to go for most things. So there are 2 pages of the main menu. So let's go over to the first page here, and you can see there's a lot of stuff here, and a lot of it's grayed out because of the mode that we're in. So the first thing I want to do is change this to manual exposure mode. So if I come down here to the second page, you can see it says shoot mode. So I select this, and there are a bunch of options here: intelligent auto, program auto, aperture priority, shutter priority, manual mode. I want manual mode. We want to get the best image quality possible out of this camera. Coming back into the menu here, the next thing I want to do is turn log shooting on. So we go to the log shooting setting here, and we click that. And when we come here, there's a couple different options, but they're grayed out until we turn log shooting on. So if we click here and we turn it on, you see it says flexible ISO. Now, this is some new language in the last few years with Sony. Flexible ISO is the normal exposure mode. The other one is Cine EI, which is in the FX cameras. So if you're curious about how to shoot in Cine EI or any of that stuff, I made a very detailed video about that, and I'll leave that link down below. But flexible ISO is normal shooting. It's like, you know, ISO works like ISO normally works in the camera. So they just updated the language so it's consistent among all the cameras. But we're going to select this to turn it on. And there's a couple different options in here. We have the color gamut. Of course, we're shooting in S-Log3, but there's two options in terms of the gamut. That's the color space. That's the first thing. So sgamut3.cine, that's the color gamut, and S-Log3 is the gamma. So we want to choose this first one. That's the most common one, which is by default. The next thing is embed LUT file. So this doesn't bake the LUT into the image. You're still going to get a log file that's recorded, but basically it saves the LUT into the metadata. So if you are bringing this into Sony software, you could see which LUT you are shooting with. So I just leave it on, but it doesn't really matter because it won't bake the LUT into the footage. So I just want to mention that. The next thing is go up to the first page here, and we're going to change a bunch of settings, of course. I'm going to skip around a little bit. File format. So let's talk about file format. There are a bunch of different options in here. In terms of 4K, which is what we're going to be talking about, we have the XAVC SI, XAVC S, and XAVC HS. So starting with the SI, this is a H.264 all intra codec. So this is going to be the largest file size, the best image quality, the easiest to edit, all those things, but it's significantly larger in terms of file size. If you're using a really old computer, this is probably the setting that you want to set it to, but if you're shooting on any of the M1, M2, M3, M4 Max, you can shoot in anything you want, and it's not a big deal. The XAVC-S is H.264, but it's a long GOP or long GOP compression. It's smaller than the SI, but it's a little bit more taxing on your computer. Again, if you're using a current Mac, not an issue. And then XAVC-HS4K is the H.265 compression. This is what I recommend for most people because it's the same file size as the XAVC-S, but it's going to be higher quality. And again, this is a little bit more taxing on your computer. So you'll have to play with it with your computer and make sure it works. But this is the one that I recommend for most people. The next thing is let's choose our frame rate. So you can choose 24 or 60. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, in this camera and a couple of the other Sonys, if you're in the XAVC-HS, you can't shoot in 30 frames per second. So if you need 30 frames per second, make sure you choose one of the other codecs. And I do want to mention here that if you come down next to the file format, we have the record settings. This will tell you the bit rate and bit depth. So you always want to choose the maximum, which is the 100 megabits per second, 4.2 to 10 bits. So make sure you choose that one. The next thing here is going to be the shutter speed, which of course we can change whenever we want. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this for my 24 frames per second because I don't change my shutter speed unless I change my frame rate. If you are curious about how to expose and color grade S-Log3, I made a very detailed video about that. I'll leave that video linked down below as well. So we're going to select 1/48 because we're shooting at 24 frames per second. 1/50 would also work just fine. The aperture here, we're going to control, of course, throughout shooting. So whatever, 5.6 is fine. Coming into the ISO settings, you can see that it's set to auto ISO, which we want to control that. We want to shoot this at the base ISO of 800. So as I scroll down here, you can see that some of these ISOs have little bars next to them, like under the 320, 400, 500, so on. You can see that 800 is the first one that doesn't have the bars. That is your base ISO. This will give you the best dynamic range and image quality. And, it's interesting because, the FX30, which has the same sensor as this camera, has a dual base ISO from Sony. That's what they say. So this one doesn't, even though it has the same sensor. So shoot at 800 for most things. Again, if you want to learn more about exposing, color grading, go check out that video. Next is white balance. I do not use auto white balance because it's a nightmare when you go to grade it. You should learn how to control your white balance as best as possible. For right now, I'll just leave it on sunny, but usually I'm just choosing sunny or shady or cloudy or, the incandescent lights if you're inside using tungsten. It gets you pretty close, but you can also go in there and tweak the white balance with the custom Kelvin control here, or you can use the custom white balance feature, which works really well. I do talk about that in that exposure video. So we're going to select sunny for right now. Now over here to select the LUT, this is the, like I said, the display LUT. So if you're used to view assist on some of the older Sony cameras, it's kind of been replaced with this. And again, this isn't baked into the image. So when you're shooting in log and you're using one of these, there's just display LUTs. It doesn't bake these in. So if you choose S-Log3, then it basically just shows you the log image. I don't know why it's an option in there, but it is. S709 is what I recommend for most people. And that will just give you kind of a little bit more contrast and saturation, allow you to judge the image a little bit better. That's usually what I recommend here is the S709. So you can totally use the S709 display LUT, but you can actually load your own custom LUTs into this camera, which is awesome. And again, like I said, this is a display LUT, so it doesn't bake it in. But the nice thing is that you can put in your custom LUT and you can view it just as you would normally, use the camera, and you're going to see exactly what it's going to look like. And then when you bring the footage into your computer, you can just apply the LUT and you already know what you're going to get. So really, really cool. So in the camera here, if we go down to the first one, you can see the user one. There's lots of different user LUTs in here you can add in. But we'll go to the first one and we'll go over to the right and we're going to go to import. Now, for you to properly be able to import the LUT into the camera, you have to put it in a specific folder on the SD card. So format the SD card in the camera. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Put in your computer, load the LUT into a very specific folder, and you can find this folder by going into the SD card, Private, Sony, Pro, and LUTs. Put your LUT into the LUTs folder and then put the card back into the camera. Otherwise, it won't register it. But make sure it's in that proper folder. So coming in here to import, I have in here a one of the phantom LUTs, so very common LUT for Sony users. So I have that in here, the neutral LUT. So if I select that and hit OK, it loads it in. There's a couple different options here. You can see input because for every LUT it has an input that it's looking for. In this case, the phantom LUT is set up for S-Gamma 3.Cine S-Log3. You have the exposure offset, and you can also delete it. So now I have this selected here. So if I select this, when I go to use the camera, I will see the phantom LUT displayed properly on the screen. So really handy to have that control in the camera. Okay, coming down here, you can turn the LUT on and off just like that right there. And coming down to the bottom row, we have the proxy recording. You can set up proxy recordings with this camera. Using any of the modern Macs, like I said, I don't have any issue with these files, but if you do need proxy recording, you do have that option. This is the wind noise reduction setting. I always turn this off. I don't want the camera doing any audio processing whatsoever. So if you're in a windy situation, try to control the wind noise with a dead cat or microphone placement or something like that. And if you need to do some audio processing, I recommend doing that in the computer in post. So over here is how you can set up your level. So you can change that here, and you can also see the level that you are recording right there. So this will depend on which microphone and how loud your subject is and all that sort of stuff. Onto the second page of the menu, we already talked about the log shooting mode. This is where you can format your card. So you select this and you can format your card. Over here are the file settings, and there's a few options here. We have series versus reset. So I just leave it on series so that the numbers continue. You can also reset the series. For file format, you can change it from standard to title. I like title, and I like to come in here and customize the title of the files that come into the computer. So for example here, I might want to choose, let's see here, let's make this capital. We'll choose ZV-E10. And then maybe an underscore. So when I do this, now you can see the file name is all ZV-E10 and then the number of that file. So this is really handy when you bring it to the computer because you'll know exactly which camera it came from. So I'm a big fan of that. Continuing down here, we have the shoot mode, which we already talked about. We have the microphone directivity. So we can either, this is for the on-camera microphones, we can do auto, which will automatically pick which one, front, rear, or all directions. I generally plug a microphone into the camera anyways, but you do have that option. In terms of the steady shot options, we have a few different options here. We have off, which turns off all the digital stabilization. Now there is no IBIS in this camera, so Active gives you the digital stabilization, and off turns off the digital stabilization. The standard is grayed out here because this lens does not have optical stabilization. So if you're using a lens like the kit lens that has optical stabilization, then you can choose that. And the standard would just be the IBIS, and the active would be the IBIS plus the digital stabilization. Here's where you can change the focus from manual to continuous autofocus. So I have it on manual right now because I don't want the camera trying to focus while making this tutorial, but generally most of you are going to be leaving this on autofocus. Over here we have the focus area, and so you can change this to what you're doing. I generally leave it on wide if I'm using autofocus, and you can also, there's more options than that, and I'll show you that later on. Subject recognition, turn that on and off. So if you are trying to use like human subjection or animal subjection, that's where you can turn it on or off. And then this are the different targets. So you can either use human, animal, or bird. So if you're shooting people or shooting yourself, then turn it on human, turn this on. If you want just general autofocus and you don't want it to try to find a subject, you can just turn that off. So that wraps up the main menu here. Like I said, most of this stuff is the stuff that you need on a regular basis, and some of the stuff appears at least one other time later on in the menu, and I will show you that. All right, coming over here to the next main folder, we have the shooting menu. So the first one here, there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about. First of all, the file format, we already talked about this. We can access it from the main screen. Like I said before, a lot of the stuff you're gonna see duplicated. This is the movie settings, so 24 frames per second, and the bit rate and bit depth. Again, we already talked about this in the main menu. Now, in terms of S&Q stands for slow and quick. So you can either shoot basically a time lapse, or you can shoot slow motion and it will slow it down or speed it up to whatever your project frame rate is. So if you come into the S&Q settings here, you can change exactly what's going on here. So the S&Q record frame rate, that's going to be your base frame rate. So for me, that's 24 frames per second because I record in 24 frames per second. And over here is what the camera is going to be sampling. So as it's set up here, it's going to sample at 60 frames per second, and then it's going to convert it to 24 frames per second, which means you're going to get a times 2.5 slow motion. So this is great if you want to shoot slow-mo. It will slow it down in camera. The negatives here is that it doesn't record the sound, but you can play it back in the camera. It'll already be slowed down, which is really handy, and how I usually wind up shooting slow motion on my cameras. The other thing you can do here is you can change this to different rates. So for example, if I change this to 1 frame per second, it's going to only record 1 frame per second from what's going on and then convert it to 24 frames per second. So it's going to be a times 24 quick motion. So this is going to be a time lapse. It's going to speed it up by 24 times. So lots of different options in here for different stuff to play around with. That's S&Q mode. And you also have the option here, make sure you select your highest quality, 100 megabits per second for to do 10-bit. So there are actually two different sort of S&Q modes in this camera, and I'm going to show you the other one right now. But to get into S&Q, into the camera, and to actually shoot with it, you want to set this mode setting to S&Q like I showed you before. Now, looking at the screen, it gives you two different options. First one is the normal S&Q mode, the one I just talked about. The second one is going to be a specific time-lapse mode. So you do have the option of these two. So let me show you in the menu the difference with the time-lapse mode. So when you come into the time-lapse mode and we go into the frame rate settings, you can see it's a little bit different here. Of course, we have our base frame rate like we had before, but we have the interval time. So this isn't how many frames per second, it's the time between shots. So if we set this up for 1 second, it'll take a shot every second, which is the same as 1 frame per second. So this should act exactly the same way as the S&Q mode at 1 frame per second, but you can actually increase this to have it only record a frame every 2 seconds, etc. And as you change this, you can see at the bottom here, to get a 5-second movie, you have to record for 6 minutes. So you can actually, tweak this to get an idea of, what you're going to get with your different recording modes. So this will allow you to get a quicker time lapse, meaning more time in between each frame than the 1 frame per second in the S&Q mode. So this is something that got introduced a few years ago. Again, you can change your recording settings here. Make sure you max that out, like I said before. And the video light settings here are to control a specific light that you can attach to the camera to have it sync up with the time lapse, but I'll just leave it off for right now. But you do have the two different options for S&Q and for time lapse. So because we're not going to be shooting in S&Q right now, I'm going to flip this back into video mode. Now coming in the menu here, we can go down to log shooting settings, and this is what we talked about before. In the main menu, we have log shooting on or off, color gamut, embed LUT file. So again, all the stuff we saw before. Proxy settings, like I showed before, you can turn it on off, but the more deep settings here, you can change those if you need to come in here and do proxy recording. Next, we have lens compensation, and coming in here, there's a bunch of different stuff. Now we have, for example, shading compensation, chromatic aberration compensation, distortion compensation, and breathing compensation. So I recommend that you leave all of these on for the most part, especially the first three, because a lot of the lenses that we're using nowadays are designed to work with these mirrorless cameras, and the cameras know that the faults in the lenses and will automatically correct for them in the best possible way, and they're designed to work together. So I usually recommend leaving at least the first three on, and you can see here that the distortion compensation is on auto, but it's grayed out. You can't actually turn it off. So that's just unique to this lens, is the Sigma 18-50. And then the last one is the breathing compensation. This is for focus breathing. So this one, I can't turn it on because it's the Sigma lens, but if you're using a lot of the Sony lenses, you can use focus breathing compensation. If you don't know what focus breathing is, it's when you change the focus of the lens, you can see the camera zooming in and out. So it can do that, has a method of compensating for that. It does crop in a little bit depending on the lens that you're using. Pretty cool feature, but again, this is the Sigma 18-50, so it is grayed out here. But I recommend the other ones, you always leave them on. The breathing compensation, turn on or off depending on what you're trying to do. All right, coming down to the second page here, to media, we can format our card, which again, we can do in the main menu. Recovering image database. This, I've never actually used this, but if you use a device like a computer or another camera to put images on the SD card, and then you load the SD card back in the camera, and it may not find all the files, you can recover the image database, and it basically goes and finds all the files and sets up the database in the camera. I've actually never used this before, but that's what that's for. And display media info. Basically, this shows you how much time is left on the card based on the selected codec. So you can also see this in the home screen. So if we come out here, you can see, 5 hours and 18 minutes as well. So it's just another place you can see that in the camera. On to the third one here, file. If you choose write serial number, this will add the camera serial number to the metadata. I have it off, but you could turn it on if you want to. Now, under file settings here, this is the stuff we showed before, or I showed before with the series and the title, the ZV-E10. We already showed you this. Again, you can start to see that a lot of the stuff in the main menu is repeated elsewhere. Sometimes there's a few more options, but generally it's the same thing. All right, on to the fourth page here, shooting mode. The first one is the camera set memory, and basically you can record all the settings in your camera to a bunch of different memory recalls, so that if you have certain scenes or situations that you want to shoot in or whatever, you can set them up here and you can recall them whenever you want. I just want to mention that if you set up one of these memory recalls and then you're shooting in that memory recall and then you change some settings, the only way it saves the settings in there are if you come in here and resave it. So it doesn't update them live. So I just want to let you know about that. But anyways, if we come in here, we have memory 1, 2, and 3, and then M1 through M4. M1 through M4 have to do with being on that specific SD card, but 1, 2, and 3 will be in the camera. And you can, whatever you do and you hit save here, it will save all those settings. So exposure control, log, not log, autofocus settings, all that stuff. When you come in here and you hit this button, it will register it into number 1. And then whatever you're doing in the camera, if you go to memory 1, it will pull that up. So the way that you can get there is here. So you can see we have the manual exposure mode, and now you can see you have 1, 2, 3, etc. So we can just choose 1, and now that is in there. The other way to do that is if you're in the main menu, like where we chose manual mode before here, you can see you have the MR memory recall, but I'm going to put it back to manual for right now, like I had before. Okay, and the reason why the S&Q is grayed out here is because we're not in S&Q, but if you had memory settings for S&Q, you could actually put them in there as well. All right, on to the next page here, we have shutter and silent mode. So the silent mode settings here, if we come in here, if we turn silent mode on, it will keep the camera completely silent. I personally like this. I don't like it making noises when I stop and start recording and stuff like that. So if you turn this on, it will just completely silence the camera, but I'll leave it off for right now so we can talk about some of these other settings. The target function settings, this one is interesting. I think this is mainly for photo and not video, but basically it's a thing in the camera that opens up the aperture to get more light, to get better autofocus right before, and then it closes the aperture back down to whatever you have it set at. So again, I think this is more a photography thing, but there are different options here. Not target here is for when silent mode, we'll change the setting. Standard is the standard mode, and then silent priority, it will keep the lens quieter. So again, I think this is more of a photography thing, so I'll just leave it on standard for right now. Next thing we have is release without a lens, and I recommend turn this to enable. Basically, if you're using a manual lens or a lens that doesn't have electronic contacts, you want to still be able to start and stop recording, so make sure you have this enabled. Anti-flicker set allows you to change your shutter speed to a very small amount to help reduce shutter flickering and banding and stuff like that with fluorescent lights and LED walls or LED TVs or LCD TVs and stuff like that. So if we come in here, we can turn this on. This is variable shutter. And then to the variable shutter set, you can see here that we're at 48, 1/48 in terms of the shutter. And if I change this, you can see it changes by very small amounts. So it's really handy when you, like I said, you're trying to dial in the shutter speed to get rid of flickering or banding on fluorescent lights and TVs and stuff like that. So you can also hit this button here or hit the button in the middle, and it will try to automatically scan the environment and select the shutter speed that would work for you. But I'm going to leave this off for right now. So if you're curious about how to, change it small amounts, you can do that with the variable shutter in here. Onto the 6th page is audio recording. Of course, we want to leave the audio recording on unless you want to turn it off for whatever reason. Audio recording level, like I showed before, you get in the main menu. Audio timing, I leave that on live. I think that is what works the best for me. Wind noise reduction, as I said, leave that off. Next, we have microphone directivity, which we talked about before. In the main menu, you can choose between auto, front, all directions, or rear. And we can actually reduce the options if you want to just have less options. So if you only want to toggle between front and rear, for example, you can deselect auto in all directions. And when you're out here in the main screen here, if you touch this, you can see it just toggles between front and rear. So if you want to limit your options here, you can do that. I'll just turn these all back on for right now. Next, we have the NI shoe audio settings, and this is if you put one of the audio devices directly in the hot shoe, so like the XLR-K3M or one of the other microphones that plug into that from Sony, you'll have some more options there as well. Now, this camera technically does support timecode, but it's a little bit limited. There's no way to actually jam sync timecode into this camera like you can in the FX30 and FX3 with that special cable. So I just want you to keep that in mind here. There are some options here. If you do need to push timecode into this camera, I recommend you do it through the 3.5mm jack and use something like the Deity TC1 or the Tentacle Sync and those kinds of things. So it does have some timecode settings in here, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. Next, onto page 8, we have image stabilization. And this is, again, like we saw it in the main menu here, to change this from active to standard to off. I do want to mention that if you are using a lens that doesn't have electronic contacts, or it's a vintage lens or something like that, or cinema lens, where the camera can't read the focal length, make sure that you come in here and set this manually. So if you're going to be using digital stabilization in this camera, you also need to tell it what the focal length is. So if you have it on auto, which is fine for most lenses where it can figure out what the focal length is, but if you can't, you can go to manual here and you can change the focal length to whatever lens that you are using, and then it'll work properly. Onto the 9th page here, we have the zoom options. So the first thing here is the zoom range, and this is going to be what the zoom rocker on the top of the camera is going to do. So you have optical zoom only, which is what I personally use most of the time. I don't really use clear image zoom that much. Clear image zoom is a really cool technology that's in Sony cameras that allows you to zoom in digitally without much of a loss in quality. I did make a video about clear image zoom. I'll leave that video linked down below as well. And then you have digital zoom, which is very similar to clear image zoom in that it's a digital zoom. The quality isn't as good as clear image zoom, but it does allow you to zoom in further. So you have your different options here. I'm just going to choose optical zoom only because, frankly, with this camera, I tend to bump the zoom rocker quite a bit, and I don't want to use clear image zoom most of the time, so I'll leave that there. But you have the option to change that. For zoom, step zoom magnification, you have different options to see how much it's going to zoom in. Zoom lever speed, this has different options for standby and for recording, so that way you can either zoom faster or slower. If you're using a custom key to control these zoom settings, other than the rocker, you can change the speeds there. And then if you're using a remote to do this, you can change the settings here. All right, on to page 10 for shooting display. We'll talk about grid lines. Now this top option here is to turn the grid line display on and off in general. So if we turn this on, now it will show grid lines on the screen, and we have different options. So like rule of thirds, golden ratio, all these different things. So for example, if you want rule of thirds on there and you come out of here, well, it's black. Let me take the lid off for a second. You can see that we have the rule of thirds on there. So that's how you can turn that on or off right here. And then the other thing we have is the emphasized recording display. So if you have that on and you press record, let's put it back on, and you hit record, it will put the red box around the outside. So if you want that, that's there. If not, you can come in there and turn that off. So I'm going to come in here and just turn the grid display off and turn the recording display off. The reason why I have it off is because there is a tally light on the camera and it takes up more real estate on this tiny screen. So I like to see more of the screen, but that's an option there for you as well. All right, on to page 11, we have marker display. And the top one here is what will allow all of the marker displays to turn on or off altogether. We have center markers. So that is that cross in the middle there. We have the aspect markers, which is cool. So for example, if you want to see, let's keep shooting vertical, but 9:16. For example, if you want to crop for 9:16 out of a horizontal image, you have safety zone for 80 or 90%. And you also have the guide frame here. So you have a lot of different options. And if you turn any of these on or off, you can just turn all of them on or off with that marker display at the top there. All right, on to the 12th page. We have a lot of different stuff in here. First of all is product showcase. This is the feature that's in the ZV cameras where the camera tends to focus on objects you hold up and that are closer to the camera. You can also toggle this on or off in the main screen here. So if I go over here, I can turn product showcase on or off. This is really great if you are, doing product reviews and you're holding up stuff to the camera, you want it to try to focus on the thing you're holding up, make sure you turn that on, so that is an option in here. Next up, we have the defocus level settings. So this camera and the other ZV cameras have the option to hit a button and put it in defocus mode. What that does, especially if you are shooting in an automatic exposure mode, is it will open the aperture as open as possible to get the blurriest background, and then it will adjust all of the other settings to get the exposure to be proper. Now, if you're shooting in manual mode, you probably know this, that you want to open up the lens all the way and then you'll make your adjustments that way, but you can just hit this button right here and it will go to the background defocus mode. So in the camera here, you can actually set the different levels of background defocus. So if you want more out of focus, you go to large. If you want less, you go to small. Next option here is the cinematic vlog setting, or known as Cine Vlog. I think this is really cool. This adds the black bars on the top and the bottom of the screen automatically without having to do anything in post. I think it just looks really cool. It does lock a few settings, but if you're more of the auto shooter and you just want it to look cool and more cinematic, then you can turn this on. I think this is a cool feature. So coming in here, you can turn this on. Now it does lock some of the features, like I said, but you can choose your look. So like S-Cine tone or some of this other stuff, or even some of the user LUTs in here. And then you also have the option for different moods. So you definitely have, a few different options in here, but if you want to come in here and play with this, it's a lot of fun. I'm just gonna leave this off for right now. Next up is self timer. And this is kind of self-explanatory. So you can have a 3-second timer so that when you hit it, it'll start recording in 3 seconds. Next up, we have the auto create still images. This is a really cool feature I've actually never used before, but essentially it allows you to grab stills while you're recording a video. And the way it does this, it sort of piggybacks it onto the adding of a shot marker. So while you're rolling, you can add a shot marker, which you can then see in the metadata. But if you turn this setting to on, it will actually create an image as well. So this is really cool. Now, to do this, you either have to be recording a video and you hit the shutter button, but if you have the shutter button set to also record, then you have to select a custom button to add a shot marker. So I'll show you how to set up custom buttons a little bit later. But again, this allows you to grab images while you're recording video. Really, really cool. Now this last setting is just a little nuanced here, but basically if you set to auto delete, it will delete the shot markers automatically after creating still images, or maintain does not. So this is really cool. And like I said, I just want to let you know what this is. You can actually grab stills while recording video. All right, that wraps up the camera menu. Let's go down to the exposure one. So number 1, exposure here. We're on to page 16 out of 56. Auto slow shutter. This will slow the shutter speed automatically in darker scenes, but we're using manual exposure, so it doesn't really matter here. In terms of the ISO, of course, we can control this in the main menu and also I'm going to recommend using one of the dials here, like we talked about before. The ISO range limit, you can actually change the min or a max if you wanted to do that, especially more importantly for, auto ISO if you're giving it a certain range to work within, so you can change that there. Exposure compensation. This isn't going to matter for us in manual exposure mode, so we're going to skip over this. And same thing with the metering mode, because we're going to be shooting in manual exposure and using the histogram for exposure. The fourth page here, we do have options for white balance, but again, these are all the ones you can get when you get it from the main menu like I showed you before. And so these settings here are for auto white balance, so we're going to skip over those as well. Now, onto the fifth page here. We're on the fifth page, color tone. A lot of these are grayed out because we're shooting in log, so derange optimizer, creative look, picture profile. These are all if you're shooting in the non-log mode. And then the LUTs here, like I mentioned before, you can select S7 or 9 or one of the user LUTs. So this is exactly what I showed you before. Manage user LUTs. Now this is a little bit easier if you're going to be looking at all the LUTs. You can come in here and manage them versus just going and adding one by one like we did in the main menu. So you can come in here and manage them. You can delete them. You can change them, all that kind of stuff. The soft skin effect here. Please turn this off. I have made this mistake several times when testing out Sony cameras. It comes by default turned on. Make sure you turn that off. Basically, it adds this soft skin effect. It looks absolutely horrible and it takes away so much sharpness and detail, and it doesn't look very good in my opinion. So please make sure you turn that off. Next, we have the zebra display. So if you are someone that wants to use zebras or using this for proper exposure on a gray card, like I mentioned, I'll talk about that in the exposure video. I'll leave that link down below. You can come in here and you can turn the zebras on and off. And then you can come in here and change the zebra levels to something specific, or you can come in here and have a custom mode as well. So you can come in here and change this to whatever you want. So zebras are in here as well. You can turn them on and off. All right, that wraps up the exposure menu. So cruising along here, we'll go to the autofocus, manual focus modes here. So page 1, autofocus, manual focus. We're on to page 22 of 56 here. We can either turn the focus mode to manual or automatic like we could in the main menu. So preset focus and zoom. You can actually set up the camera to have a certain focus and zoom, and then it saves it as a preset in here. So that's pretty cool. I've never actually done this before, but you have lots of different places you can set that up. In terms of autofocus transition speed, this is how fast the focus will move. I generally leave this in the middle at 4 to give a really balanced approach, but this and also the subject shift sensitivity, you might want to change this depending on the lens you're using or the environment you're using. For this, I have this on 3. So this is how often it wants to change focus, and the speed is how quickly it changes focus. The next thing is the autofocus assist. I actually leave this off. But basically, when you have this on, you can have the autofocus on, and then you just change the manual focus ring to if you want to focus on something else, it will look around that area and then try to latch on to wherever you have it roughly focused there. But I tend to bump it a lot, and it doesn't actually work with all lenses. I think even the kit lens doesn't work with, so you can play with this too, but I leave this off. But it allows you to have some some manual focus control to allow the autofocus to shift around while it's in autofocus mode. Moving on to page 2 for focus area. I generally, like I said, leave this on wide, and we do only have a few options in here. If you want to change the different options, you can see there's a whole bunch more in here. So if you want to add some of these in there, or you want to limit what you see in the options, you can toggle those on and off here for the different focus areas. Next up, you have the focus area color, and this you have the option of white or red, personal preference, but I like white. Next up is if you want the focus point to circulate or not, and what this means is that when you're moving the focus point across the screen and you get to the edge, does it stop there, or does it go back to the other side and then keep going across? So if you want it to not circulate and it just goes to the edge and stops, you can do that, or circulate means it goes back to the other side and keeps going across. I'm gonna click do not circulate. And the autofocus frame amount here is how much the autofocus frame moves when you move the focus point on the screen. So either a small amount or a large amount. Next up on page 3 is the subject recognition. So we could turn this on or off. So like I said earlier on, if you wanted to recognize a subject and focus based on a subject, leave this on. If you want general autofocus, you can turn this off, but we'll leave this on for right now. In terms of the recognition target, we have the options for human, animal, or bird. So those are the only ones that we have in this camera. Next up, we can actually limit the different targets that we have. So for example, if you never are going to shoot a bird, then you can come in here and turn bird off so that when you come back to the main screen here, you are just going to cycle between human and animal. So if you really want to limit that, you can do that here, but I will leave that on for now because once in a while I do shoot birds. Right and left eye select, you can either have auto or right or left. A lot of people wonder about why you'd want this option. Often if you are like shooting it, like for example, an interview and it's a tight shot on the side and you want to have like just the close eye in focus, you could just choose left eye or right eye. Or if you see it tend to go back and forth quite a bit, you can have it just pick one. I generally leave it on auto, but you do have the option to pick one eye or the other. Next up is the subject recognition from display. This is really good. This is what puts the little box on your eye or on your face. I like to leave this on so I can see when it's registering subject detection and the autofocus is working. So I would definitely leave that on. If you want to turn it off, then you won't see that little box on people's eyes, but I do like to have that on there. Next up is the registered face priority. So this will prioritize registered faces. You can actually set this up in photo mode if you want to do that. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but if you want to go ahead and take pictures of certain subjects and it will register those and will prioritize those in here. That's a pretty cool feature. So this is where you access it here, but you have to actually take the photos and do all that in the photo menu. Onto the fourth page here, we have Focus Assistant. And the first one is the focus mapping. And this is that crazy thing where it will show you different colors on the screen and what's in focus will be clear. I made a video about that. I'll leave that video linked down below. It was debuted in the Sony a7 IV, but you can turn that on and off here. Next up, we have the focus magnifier. So if you want to zoom in, you can do that. You can change the magnification by pressing the button in the middle, and then you can operate around. And if you want to go back to the middle, you can press the delete key. So that's where you can get the focus magnifier. And then the focus magnifier time, this will say like how long it stays on there. So if you want to only stay on there for 2 seconds before turning off, 5 seconds, or just want to stay on indefinitely, you have the option there. And then the initial focus magnification, you can have it set to default as 1x zoom or 4x zoom, depending on your personal preference. Next up, we have peaking display. So generally, I use this a lot for when I am doing manual focus. So I will leave this off for right now, but I usually set a custom button on the camera because I use this quite a bit. For peaking level, I usually like high on these cameras. It allows me to see it really well. And for colors, generally I like red, but it depends on what you're shooting. But I find that red works good most of the time. Well, that wraps up the autofocus manual focus folder. So let's go down here. This is the playback options. There are a lot of different options in here, although I don't change any of these. So if you are interested, feel free to look through those and make some changes, but I do not. Now in the network settings, I want to talk about a couple things. Most of these I don't change whatsoever, but I want to talk about streaming. So first of all, here we have the network streaming option, and this is for streaming via a smartphone. I've never actually tried this before, but you can connect this to a phone and stream right through your phone, which is pretty cool. These are all the settings there, but again, I haven't tried that before. USB streaming I have used before, and this is cool. You can hook up a USB cable to your computer, and you don't need a capture card or anything like that. You can stream right from the camera. So you have the option for different resolutions and frame rates. So you can stream in 1080 30 or 4K 30. That's up to you. You can also record during your stream if you want. You can enable that, and it will tell you that the power consumption will be greater during USB streaming. So, you do have that option here, but I think for most people, you're probably going to stream in 1080p 30. That's going to be your best option. All right, so like I said, I don't change any of the other network settings, so we'll just cruise right through these, but there are a lot of options in here. Now onto the last area, the last folder is the setup. Area and date, we can change the language, the area, date, and time, which I already set up ahead of time. But here is the question that people ask me all the time, and this is NTSC versus PAL. Now, NTSC is what we use here in the United States. It gives us different frame rates of like 24, 30, 60, and 120 frames per second. If you're in Europe or other places and you're shooting with the PAL option, that's where you can get 25, 50, and 100 frames per second. So people always ask me every time I make a video, I can't see 24 frames per second or I can't see 25 frames per second. This is where you change it. So again, I'm in the United States, so I'm going to stick to NTSC. I'm not going to change to PAL. Page 2 here, we have reset and save settings. So if you want to come here and reset the settings or initialize them, you can do that. The other cool thing here is you can actually save your settings to your SD card. And this is great because if you think you're going to screw them up, or if you are going to hand your camera to someone else and you want to load your settings back in, or you want to use someone else's camera, or you set up your camera and you want to copy that onto other ZV-E10 Mark IIs, you can do that by coming in here and loading them. So that's a really cool option here. Onto the third page here is the Operation Customize. You can customize the photo keys and dials or the video keys and dials. So we're going to talk about a couple of those in here. Let's go into the custom keys and dials for video. Okay, don't show this again. Now, a lot of different options in here. You can set this up however you want. I'm going to show you how I like to set this up. So rear number 1, this button right here will actually turn the product showcase on or off. I don't use product showcase, and this is a button that, because it's a small body, that I hit pretty often. So I'm just going to turn this off for right now. But again, this is however you want to do this. So once you click on the thing that you want to customize, you can come in the menu and choose whatever you want. If you are going to choose not set, that is going to be under the last option here. And you can see not set. And that way, when you press this button, nothing will happen. A couple other things I like to change here is I don't really use the self timer. That's number 3. So it's pressing left on the dial here. I'm actually going to change that to my autofocus manual focus change. So under autofocus manual focus, I'm going to go to focus selector toggle. So now when I back out of here, I'll just show you. If I hit this here, it will just turn this from autofocus to manual focus. You can see it changing right here. That's really handy. And like I said, I just disabled this so it doesn't do anything. But let's come back in here and change some other stuff. Another thing I would like to change is I'm going to go to number 5, which is the exposure control, exposure compensation. I'm using manual focus. I'm sorry, manual exposure, so it doesn't matter. I'm going to change this to white balance. So now when I press that, it'll open up the white balance menu. But you can get there through the main menu, through the function menu, all that kind of stuff. Now, the other things in here you can change all sorts of stuff. I don't use the background defocus. So for me, I'm going to change this to change my peaking on and off because I do shoot a lot with manual focus. So I'm going to come in here and, into the autofocus manual focus. And I'm going to go to peaking display and peaking display select. So now when I press the button on the top here, that will turn my focus peaking on and off. The reason I do that is that most of the cameras I'm using, I put it somewhere over there because I'm toggling that on and off quite a bit. There's also controls in here for changing what the button does on a lens if you have a button on your lens, and then also there's some options in here for the dial. So again, you can change these to however you want. These are just some ideas of things that I like to have on this camera because I generally, like I said, I shoot in manual exposure, and I often am using manual focus because I'm using lots of different kinds of lenses. So in addition to custom key and dial settings for photo and video, we also have for playback. If you want to adjust any of those, I just leave them to their defaults. Down to the next one are the FN menu settings. So this is for photo and video, and this is for playback. So under here, you can see you have the options for photo and video. So you can come in here and change some of the stuff. So if you want to change, let's say you never want to use soft skin effect, you can come in here and say, well, I want this to choose which LUT I'm using. So you can come in here and customize this however you want. And just as a reminder, like I said, you can just hit the FN button here, or you can swipe up and it will get to that menu as well. So that's how you get into the FN menu. So this next one is important to check off. This is having different settings for stills and movies. So basically, when you switch between photo and video modes, you have different settings in there. So I actually check all of these so that when I go back and forth between photo and video, it maintains the settings in photo and video. So it's good, in my opinion, to have those separate. Next one here are the display settings for when you cycle through the display options on the main screen. So if you select this here, you can change what you see. So what this is, you have 4 different options here, and then you have the option for exposure to stay on or to timeout as well. So when you're in your main screen and you press the display here, which is the up on the pad, it will cycle through the different options here. So like these 2 here, all on just display, histogram, level. When I come in here, I can cycle these on or off. If I don't want to see the histogram and the level, then when I come back here, it will just cycle between those two. So you have the option to limit what is cycling through and that other option in there as well. Scrolling down here, there's actually a second page to the Operation Customize. So we're on page 46 out of 56 here. Now the first option is record with shutter. So I generally like to have this on, and the reason for that is that when I'm operating the camera, you can just press the shutter button and it will start and stop recording. Now for a lot of cameras, the record button is really small. This one's pretty big, it's easy to find, but it's just muscle memory for me. So I like the shutter button, just turn recording on and off. Now if I do turn that option on, you can start and stop recording with the shutter button. It grays out the other option here, which is the shot marker with shutter button. So this is what I was talking about before. If you want to, use a shot marker for getting a shot marker, but maybe also for grabbing a still, you can do that. But if you turn the shutter button to record, you can't use a shutter button to record a shot marker. So if you want to do that, use the shutter button, you can, like I said before, you can start and stop recording with this, and then this will add the shot marker. But if you want to use the shutter button to record, like I do, you can turn this on, and then you can come back here and you can change a custom button, let's say rear button, this one here, which I disabled just for the sake of demonstration here. We can come in here and we can change this to add shot marker. Right here. So now, when we were recording, we can add a shot marker with this button. So you do have the option to do that. But for me, like I said, I don't really use the shot marker thing, but I do like to have the record with shutter turned on. All right, the last thing here is the zoom ring rotate, which is grayed out, and that's because we don't have a power zoom lens. But if you did have that, you could turn this on to use the zoom ring on the power zoom lens to zoom in or out. All right, on to the fourth page here, the dial customize. It's really weird because this is exactly what we had before, so I don't know why it shows up twice, but again, this is the same thing that we had in the number 3 Operation Customize. Next, we have the My Dial settings. And basically, you can set up 3 combination dial settings that you'd like, and you can recall these with a custom button if you want. So, for example, if I want, I don't know, I could set these up to whatever I want, but if I wanted to change it so, this is shutter speed and this is, I don't know, record level, I could come in here and save that. And you can recall that with a custom key. So if I come in here and let's change that other one here, we can change this to my dial 1, 2, 3, or my dial 1, my dial 2, whatever. So when we come in here, this will toggle. You can see we have the my dial 1. So if you have custom modes or custom dials for different modes, you can set those up ahead of time and then, access them that way in the camera. Next, we can come in here and talk about the touch operation. So if you want to just turn all touch operation on and off, you can do that here, but we'll leave it on so we can come and look at some of the other settings. Coming here to the shooting screen, we have a bunch of options. You can just turn the shooting screen touch on or off. Then you have the footer icon touch. That is going to be the exposure controls on the bottom. So if you want to be able to just touch something and change it, you have the option to do that there. That's what that is. Now for swiping right, swiping left, swiping up, right now it's set up to show the displays on or off for the left and right when you swipe right or left, but you can change that. So like I can show you here, if you want to swipe them both on or off, you can do that. But if you want to change that to something else like just the left, you can get, different options there. So you have the option to customize that. Let's see, or you can just turn it off if you want. Swiping up with the function menu, like I showed you earlier, you can turn that off. Touch function in shooting, you can change it from touch focus, touch tracking. There's different options here. I like touch tracking. And if you want to change this in another spot, you can come into the function menu and you can come and change it here as well. Icon when monitor flipped. This will flip the icons when you flip the screen around. So I would leave that unflipped so that when you are filming yourself, you can see it the way you want to see it. We have 2 more options here. We have the playback screen on or off. So if you want touch during playback, then leave that on. And then also for menu. So I've been using the D-pad as much as possible here so that you can see what I'm doing, but you can just touch the screen if you do have the menu touch screen on. All right, moving on, we have page 6, accessibility. We have the screen reader. This is the option to be able to have the menu and stuff read back to you audibly if you need that. I don't, so I'm going to leave that off, but you do have options there. Next, you have enlarged screen, and this allows you to make the menu larger. So if I enable this, basically I can turn this on and off with the custom button. So if I press custom button 1 up here, you can see it zooms in. So if you need that, that's there, but I'm just going to turn this. There's different options for magnification, but I am going to turn this off. All right, moving on to the 7th one, we have monitor brightness. Now, I generally have this set to sunny weather because the screens on the Sony cameras are not great, and this will make it much brighter. I have it set to manual right now because for this demo, I didn't want it super bright. And you can also come in here and manually change the screen brightness. Now, I will say that it doesn't always benefit you to have it up all the way, because if you're in a dark environment and you have the screen cranked up, the exposure might look brighter than it actually is. So if you're outside, set it to sunny weather, but of course you have to be able to see the screen. So that's where you change the screen brightness. Display quality, I set this to high, which I did before starting this tutorial. But I think the high will burn up more battery power, but again, you can play around with that. But I'd rather have a higher display quality. Monitor flip direction, I have this set to auto, and the reason for that is that I want it to flip automatically when I flip the screen around so I can see myself and it operate correctly, and it's easy for me to see. But there are a few different options in here, as you can see as I go through them, but I just leave this on auto. Next is the vertical display on or off, and if it's on, it's on auto. So let me back out of here. So if I move the camera to a vertical position, you'll see it changes everything vertically. So if you are shooting vertical, this is a cool feature to have. If you are not shooting vertical, it can be kind of annoying. You're kind of often having to rotate like that. Maybe you are like with your phone. So like I would just say, let's leave this off for right now, unless you're shooting vertical video. All right, next, let's move on to number 8. We have the display options. We have stuff for timecode, which, like I said before, I'm going to glance over for this video. Gamma Display Assist is grayed out, and that is because of what I was saying before about the new system with when you shoot it in log, that it's in that flexible ISO mode, so you're going to use the display LUT instead of the Gamma Display Assist, but this still works for other options. So for example, like HDR, you can get this to turn on. So if we come back to the main menu and we turn log shooting off, and we come in here and choose, is it 6? Nope. 10 is HLG. So if we select HLG and then we go back to where we were, you can now see that you can turn the Gamma Display Assist on, and then you also have the option of choosing it auto or manually selected. So I just leave it as auto. But like I said before, if you're shooting in log, then it's going to be disabled anyways. So I'm going to set it back. Next, we have the auto review, which I leave off. I don't want it like playing anything back or showing me photos immediately afterwards. I'll do that myself and go back into the playback if I want that. The last thing here is the shoot mode select screen, and this has to do with the S&Q mode. So the switch on the top, which we talked about before, when we switch into S&Q mode, we get this option of going for the normal S&Q or the time-lapse mode. And if you are in here, you can choose which one you're in by pressing right there on the touch screen. So if you turn this off, let me come in the menu here, and we're going to turn this from display to not displayed. Now when we switch it over, it just goes into, I think, whichever one you're in before, but right now it's the normal S&Q mode. So that's what I'd probably leave it to, unless you're going to time-lapse mode often, but you can still change which one you're in right there. All right, next, on to the 9th page, we have the power setting options. The first one is the auto monitor off, and this will turn the monitor off after a certain period of time. I have it on set to does not turn off because I'm pretty good about turning my camera on or off when I'm not using it. I want it on, I want it on. So if I'm checking focus or framing, I don't want it to turn off. And I also had this disabled for this tutorial, so personal preference. Power save start time is how long until it goes into power save mode. Personal preference, again, I leave this disabled because I'm really good about turning my camera off, but if you're forgetful or you want it to turn off after a certain period of time, you have that option here too. The next is you can have the power save enabled or disabled or whatever by the LCD screen, opening or closing, or you cannot link it. So those are the options there. The next one is probably one of the most important settings in this camera is the auto power off temp setting, and make sure you set this to high. When you first start your camera up for the first time, it will prompt you to set it to high, and it gives you this warning. Basically, what it's doing is it's allowing the camera to run hotter, and this won't damage the camera as far as I know. I've never heard anyone having issues with it. Also, I don't think Sony would do that to their own camera, so don't stress about that. But they warn you because the physical body of the camera and probably the memory card can get pretty warm. So this is good if you are using it on a tripod or gimbal or something where you don't have your hands on the camera. I haven't any issue with the camera like burning myself or whatever, but please turn this on or it'll seriously limit the amount of runtime that's on the camera. All right, moving on to number 10, we have the sound options. So the first one is the playback monitor volume. So if you're watching clips back, this will be the volume level you can hear it at. The next is the 4-channel audio monitoring. Now we are only using 2 channels here, but if you have the XLR K3 unplugged in, you can have the option to monitor different channels depending on what you want to listen to when you are making your recordings. The audio signal shooting are disabled here because I had it in the silent shooting mode because I don't like it beeping when I'm starting, stopping recording, but you do have the option to change the audio signal level here. Next, on to page 11, we have the USB settings. So the first one here is the USB connection mode. Select when connected. I like this. It prompts you when you plug something in, and then you can choose, or you can force it if it's not an option or it's not working right. You can or you only want to use one option, you can come in here and select this. But I leave it on select when connected. Next up is the USB LUN setting. This is the logical unit number. I don't really know exactly what this is, but I think for most situations you want to leave it on multi, and if you're having issues, try single, but as by default, it's on multi, so leave it on multi. Lastly, you have the USB power supply, and if you have this camera hooked up to a computer and you want it to get power from the computer, leave this on. If you don't want it to get power from the computer, turn that off. All right, on to the 12th page here. We have the HDMI resolution. For this, I generally recommend auto because it'll select the best thing, but if you want to force it to, 4K or 1080p, you can do that, but generally auto is good. Now, coming into the HDMI settings, we have a few different options here. The first one is, do you want to record media during HDMI output, on or off? So if you turn it off, then you cannot record internally. And you have this cool graphic at the bottom here to show you exactly what's going on. So for right now, it's showing I want to stream out at 4K, let's say 24 frames per second, and I am not recording internally. But for example, if I do want to record internally, then I am limited to only 1080 over HDMI. So for example, if you are recording internally but using an external monitor, this is how I'd have it set up because I want to record 4K internally and send maybe 1080p out to a monitor. So there are some different options here, but you are limited that if you are recording internally, you can't also output 4K. Scrolling down here, and like I said, you can see the different options at the bottom here. The timecode output, if you turn this on, this will allow you to have the record control on, and the record control is cool. So when you press record on the camera, it will also trigger recording on an external monitor if you're doing that. But if you have this turned off, then you cannot do that. And then the 4-channel audio output, you can select either channel 1, channel 2, or channel 3, channel 4 to go out over HDMI. All right, coming out to this screen again, the HDMI info display, this is what will tell the camera to send the on-screen information out to over HDMI. So if you want to see what's going on the camera with all the settings and all the exposure and all that stuff, turn this on. If you want a clean feed going out, make sure you turn this off. So that's where that option is there. If you are looking to get a clean feed out for streaming or for recording, make sure you turn that off. But if you're using it for monitoring and you want to see what's on the screen, you can turn that on. Now, control for HDMI, I've never actually used this, but this has to do with connecting the camera to a television and getting the control through the TV. Page 13 is the setup options. So the video light mode, this has to do with using a specific LED with this camera. I've never actually done that, but that option is in here. Next up, we have the recording lamp, and that is the tally lamp. So let me show you where that is. So that is this guy right here. So turning that on or off. So I like having that little tally lamp. I think it's really handy. But if you want to turn that off, you can turn that off here. Pixel mapping is something that the camera prompts you to do periodically. Basically, it optimizes the image sensor, and it's good to do this every once in a while. Version, this is where you can see what firmware that either the camera or the lens is at, and you can also, when you load firmware onto the SD card in the root directory of the SD card, put in the camera, you can actually update the software, with the firmware with that software update that will illuminate. You can select that on there. Display the serial number, of course, you can see that, and the privacy notice. All right, so we've reached the bottom of the menu, but I do want to go back and talk about something I mentioned at the beginning, which was the My Menu, before we hop out of the menu completely. So coming back up to the top, we have our My Menu, and this is an area where you can add whatever you want in there, so it's easy to access. So if you use stuff often, or if you're having trouble finding stuff on a regular basis, you can put that in here and store them. So under My Menu settings, we can add an item. So we can come in here and select something. So I don't know, whatever you want. Let's say we want to have, I don't know, focus area, sure. And we go in here and we put it in the My Menu 1. And we back out of this. You can see that under My Menu 1, now we have all the things we added, so focus area, and you can come in and modify them and delete them and all that sort of stuff, so it's pretty easy. So that's how you add items into your My Menu, but there's another way that's a lot faster, and there's another cool thing I want to show you, so let me show you that. So if we come to anything in the menu, so let's say file format, for example, and you hit the delete key here, the trash can, it will pop up this little menu. So first of which, if you want to add this to My Menu, you can just add this to My Menu. So let's do that. And then you can select, where you want to put it. So that's even faster than, having to go through the other menu and set it up that way. So if you're somewhere where you want to save it into My Menu, you can do that by just hitting the delete key. The other thing is when you hit this, you can go to In Camera Guide. And this will actually give you a description of whatever that is. So if you have questions and you don't want to dive into the manual, I would check there first. So hit the delete key. And it'll give you the in-camera guide to give you a little bit more information. Anyways, that is pretty much the ZV-E10 Mark II. There's a couple things I left out, but those things, like I said, I leave to as default. Hopefully this gets you going and you found value in this video. And if you did enjoy the video, hit subscribe. It would be greatly appreciated. And check out the affiliate links down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.